Tens of thousands of Americans had gone in last century to fight the world wars in order to defend the freedoms and the ideologies that they held dear. Today, the same ideologies that the Americans fought against last century, fascism and Nazism, are being fought in the mainland of America. Reza, what has caused this huge historical shift that it is acceptable to be a white supremacist in the United States today?
Possibly the biggest factor that has led to the acceptance of white supremacists is the election of President Donald Trump. He's never really taken a very strong position on this issue, and he even now, after the violence in Charlottesville, and especially after the way in which a white supremacist drove his car into protesters and killed one person, the position he took was bewildering. I mean, and that's the sort of positioning that leads to the growing strength of white supremacists, which gives them more courage to come crawling out of the woodwork.
But is it only Donald Trump the factor? If you really look at the kind of literature that is out there from the alt-right movement, the contention that they have is that the alt-right movement was there before Trump came in, and it is going to be there even after Trump leaves. So there is an undercurrent of sort of frustration against probably all the privileges that immigrants and the black community are getting in a country where whites are the majority. So don't you think that that is a factor that needs to be taken into account?
Well, I said Trump is one of the factors. White supremacists never went away. I mean, you had people like Timothy McVeigh. You had some very serious terrorist attacks by white supremacists. In fact, more people have been killed in America by white supremacists than by other terror groups. And these are people, you know, these are very extremely radicalized people. They have been on the fringes. What has happened is that the election of Donald Trump has moved them closer to the mainstream. And, you know, they have these perceived, problems. You know, it's not as if they are going to be made into a minority in any way by all the refugees that have come to the U.S. or by, you know, they would be made a minority by the non-whites. So it's these perceived injustices that they feed on, and, you know, this is sort of things that drives them. And that's why you have more and more of these people coming into the mainstream, and, you know, the alt-right and all the publications that they've been able to put together, all the sort of the way they've used social media to mobilize themselves.
I think that the interesting aspect of terrorism that you brought in your answer needs to be explored slightly more, because we are now facing the question whether white supremacy or racism should be considered as part of terrorism.
Well, if you just go by the sort of methods that's been used, if a truck driven by an Islamic State member into a crowd and it ends up killing a lot of people, and if that is terrorism, then Charlottesville was basically the same thing. You had a guy who took a car and drove into a crowd. I mean, if that isn't, if you're going to use the same yardstick, if that wasn't terrorism, then what else is it? So there's no, and these are groups that have carried out massive bombings using homemade vehicle-borne IEDs. So in my book, I mean, it's no less terrorism than the terrorism by other groups.
Now let us, at least to some extent, for the sake of fairness, let us put ourselves into the shoes of these white kids, youngsters, millennials, who are fighting this sort of civilizational war, if you will. Their contention is that years of civil civil rights movement and the affirmative action in favor of the blacks, and the Black Lives Matter movement that came after these police killings, they have been pushed to sort of a reactionary ideology. And do you think that the kind of social atmosphere that is there in the post-Trump era is contributing to that?
Well, I mean, I would just look at the basic realities. I mean, when did the US get its first black president? I mean, it just happened just recently. I mean, about 8 years ago, 8, 9 years ago. And I mean, that's like you had the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. That's how long it took. It's not as if non-whites have overtaken the U.S. and have cornered all the positions of influence and power. I mean, the blacks and other groups, Indians or whatever, brown skin, the dark skinned people, these are not in a majority. And I mean, I don't know where these people are able to derive their fear from. They're still the majority. They're still powerful. Yes, there have been leaders who have not addressed the problems of people in what is known as the Rust Belt of the US. But these are economic problems, but you cannot use these problems to turn to violence of the nature that we are seeing. And over what? Over the statue of a general who was involved in the US Civil War? I mean, that's more than 100 years ago. I mean, how does that, reflect the reality of today's US?
The violence in Charlottesville is a symbol. It is a symbol of how a country elects a leader who taps into the frustrations of the majority community. And then the use for that sort of frustration, that sort of emotions is over when he is elected. And he will be forced to sort of take a stance against them or to sort of stay away from them. But the damage has been done. The society has been divided. The divisions that were there for years are kind of moving out again and showing up in the form of white supremacy. This may be familiar to you. Thanks for watching.